Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about remote ID. The final ruling was just announced, and I know there's a lot of confusion, so the goal today is to try to simplify it for both hobbyists and 107 pilots. And I couldn't do this by myself, so I invited Ryan Latourette back for another conversation since everybody seems to really like him when it comes to these things. Let's get started. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on today. I know you have had a busy couple of days. You've been reading the rules, and what is it, 470 pages, if I'm not mistaken.
470 pages for remote ID and another, 270 pages for flight over people and night operations. So yeah, it's been very busy.
Okay, so first off, the final ruling's been announced, and I know a lot of people are sort of curious as what this exactly means. We've been hearing remote ID for the past year. So give us the good news.
So yeah, the really good news here is everyone out there participated. We saw over 50,000 comments when the NPRM was first announced. And with those 50,000 comments, you made a difference. The original rule that the FAA had in mind changed drastically, and it was because of the public comments. The FAA noted that in their final rule paper. They stated a majority of the comments were from hobbyists, and that those comments really changed their feelings about many of the items in the final rule. So pat yourselves on the back if you made a comment. Pat yourselves on the back if you encouraged others to make a comment, because that's what got this done, is everybody coming together with some idea of how this rule needed to be changed in order for it to be successful. And you did it for the most part. There's still some tweaks. So there's still some tweaks that I think, we'll go through and we'll kind of have your ire about. But at the same token, a lot has changed that makes this rule much more reasonable.
So for I guess this also a good way to say this is that this is not just remote ID, the rule. It's sort of going to change the way that we operate going forward entirely. What we know as a UAS pilot is evolving going forward. So for lack of better words, in my first assessment of it, I think it's better. But it obviously depends on who you are, whether it's going to be better. So what I want to do is sort of break this down in a couple of different ways. I want to talk to the hobbyists first. Then I want to go ahead and talk to, I don't want to say the secondary hobbyists, but I want to talk to the homebrew guys, the FPV guys that are curious as to, okay, what the hell's happening here with this ruling? And then I want to go ahead and talk about the commercial aspect and how this is going to affect 107 pilots, because there's been some drastic changes, but I guess drastic is a wrong word. There's actually been some improvements to the quality of life for 107 pilots, if I'm going to put it lightly. So, Ryan, what do hobbyists have to be concerned with tomorrow?
Nothing.
Perfect.
and that's where this really starts to snowball, right? Is that people get this remote ID. Oh, the new rules are out. It's starting to impact me tomorrow. No, it's not. I think people have to understand first and foremost that there are timelines for this. Right. And the big timeline is that this is the final rule that still has to be published into the Federal Register before it can become the regulation. So we get it now. We aren't going to see it publish until next month. And then it doesn't become active for another 60 days. So literally we're sitting on 2 months plus of time before it becomes active. Now that's the first part, the 60 days until it goes into effect. The next part is that even after it goes into effect, there's still nothing on the part of anybody really, except to say that manufacturers are going to start to have a deadline, and operationally, we're going to start to see a deadline creep up. Gotcha. But that first deadline is 18 months after the 60 days. So literally, we're talking 20 months, almost 2 years time before the first part of remote ID becomes, in fact, remote ID. And
Gotcha.
even then, there's still nothing that's impacting operations. That's for the manufacturers. We have another set of time that's going to take place, another year from that 18-month part to get to where it actually impacts us as flyers. So that's 30 months plus the 60 days. So now you're at you're at 32 months plus however many days it takes for them to publish. So you're literally talking almost 3 years time before it really starts to impact us as flyers.
Right. And I think a lot of people were concerned with, oh my gosh, just got this brand new drone, especially hobbyists, right? They just
Right.
bought this brand new drone, or they're buying drones because they're on clearance or whatever the case may be. And oh my gosh, now this new rule comes, I can't fly. And that's not the case. And I think the other thing we need to remember as a hobbyist perspective goes, most of these drones that we are operating have a shelf life. You're probably going to end up upgrading to a drone that is going to be remote ID compliant or be able to meet those specifications or requirements. But let's just say, for the instance that you don't, break down the differences with remote ID, because I see we have a broadcast module, we have identification areas. So there's different ways that this could potentially play out depending on what you choose.
So before we even get to having remote ID, one of the key pieces of the remote ID proposal that the FAA put forward was in the registration area. For hobbyists, what they were proposing was that instead of paying the $5 fee to go ahead and get your entire fleet registered under you, they were proposing that you would have to individually register each and every drone for $5 a piece. So the majority of hobbyists own multiple drones. In fact, there's a point in there where the AMA had basically stated our people own approximately 8 drones each. Well, 8 drones times $5. That's some pocket change coming out just for registration and doing that each and every 3-year cycle. So one of the big changes that took place because of all the comments was that no longer is the FAA going to pursue having each and every drone individually registered at $5 a piece, but they're going to continue with the existing registration process. $5 covers all the drones in your fleet as a hobbyist. Nothing changed in terms of the Part 107. You're still registering those individually. So you're still paying $5 each. But for the hobbyist, that was probably a very big deal. You can continue with your fleet, entire fleet, for $5.
Yeah, I can see that was some pushback there. So what are they doing in regards to the hobbyists? So is this going to be a module, a universal module that is going to be able to be essentially registered to each of their devices, each of their units that they have, and be able to, I'm assuming it's going to mount. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, so now we're getting into where you actually have the remote ID for your drone. And there's some different types. So within 18 months, after the 60 days after it publishes, so 20 months time, you're going to have manufacturers be required to create any new drone with a remote ID broadcast capabilities. Those new drones are going to be in that standard, or the initial standard broadcast that is potentially going to be able to fly beyond visual line of sight at some point. It's going to have everything internal to the drone that does the broadcasting, that is able to stop the drone from taking off if it doesn't check out on the first attempt at broadcast capabilities. That's what's going to be created. Now, I just bought a brand new drone, right? I got one for Christmas. Those people are concerned about, hey, is my drone going to be this paperweight, right? I've got this very expensive paperweight in 18 months. No, that's not the case. Again, we're talking 30 months plus the 2 months of time for the registry to kick in, our federal registry to kick in.
Right.
That module that they're talking about hasn't yet been developed. No one yet has this. That module is going to be something that can be placed onto your drone. It's going to have the broadcast capability. It's not going to have any relation with your ground control station if you have a ground control station. Most won't anyway. And that is going to broadcast out to an unlicensed FCC Part 15 network.
Gotcha.
And the idea is that you're going to be able to mount this module onto any drone that you want. They're estimating that module is running around $50. How they come up with that, who knows? But that's what they're thinking that it will be. Now, if you're a hobbyist out there and you're saying, well, where am I going to get this module? It's for certain that the major players in the drone industry are going to create and manufacture these modules. But the FAA actually opened it up too, and they said anybody can create these. So if you're an engineering
type, a guideline for that, right?
They do have a guideline.
They have a stringent set of rules that they say, hey, if you're going to manufacture this module, you have to follow X, Y, and Z for it to be remote ID compliant.
Yep, it's got to have these protocols, and we've got to approve it. But there's that opportunity that somebody out there could say, hey, I can figure out how to do this with my cell phone, or how to take a chip and create something, and that could go on to your drone and be compliant. That's not to say that's what you want to do.
Right.
There's a good chance that DJI, Autel, Parrot, whoever is going to come out with these modules, and it may not even be those companies, but you're just going to be able to, bolt that thing on in some way.
Interesting. So as of right now, like we just to recap, the rehash for those that are probably just coming on and joining, 3 years out still, we don't even have a manufacturer technically identified. I know there were some players. I know like Kitty Hawk was one of them talked about. I believe Air Maps was another. So there's going to be plenty of people producing this hardware. It's obviously going to be small enough and non-obtrusive to be able to mount to most consumer grade drones. We're not even getting to the commercial side of life. So that sounds good. So with this remote ID, what's the deal with how far or how high somebody can fly? Because I know before this was actually announced, some people were hearing speculation that you were going to be capped at 300 feet. Is that even something that is a conversation at this point?
Yeah, I think there was a hint from the FAA administrator reading to children or talking to children in a class, and he had said, well, remote ID is not going to apply unless you're 300 feet in the air. Everybody kind of grabbed on that and said, oh, look, This is exciting news. Well, it wasn't. The same is still going to apply. We're still going to have a max ceiling of 400 feet for hobbyists. You're still going to have to apply for airspace authorization through Lance. Nothing of that nature changes. What does change is in terms of the remote ID aspect is now your position where you are physically located is going to be broadcast out to the public, to everybody.
Know who you are at this point now.
They are going to be able to find you to an extent. When we're talking about the bolt-on remote ID, that is not going to pinpoint to your ground station position, right?
Right. It's a one-way transmission. They can find the drone, but they can't find the operator at that point.
Right. So it will announce your takeoff point, but if you move, you aren't there, they can't find you. And that's one of the reasons that they had capped that and saying, we are not going to allow that type of bolt-on module to fly beyond visual line of sight. They instead had stated that the standard remote ID is going to potentially be able to fly beyond the line of sight because they're going to know your exact position.
So for that module, nothing changes essentially, because as of right now, you're expected to be able to maintain visual line of sight. So
Correct.
for standard identification, potentially there hasn't been there's been indication that they're going to allow beyond visual line of sight. And I guess my next question would be, so we have all this in place, these wonderful things, these modules, and people can bolt them to their existing drones. Let me be devil's advocate and just ask, how the hell do they expect to enforce this? What means of detection are they going to be using to determine whether or not a drone has a digital license plate? I mean, they're obviously not going to use, the Citizen's Watch to do this. So how are they going to enforce this?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the real curiosity, right? Is that if you are a law-abiding citizen, you're going to follow remote ID. You're going to get the Voltron. You're going to buy the new drone that has the remote
Sure.
ID. And when your drone is in the air, indeed, the police, anybody is actually, they're going to be able to determine, yes, that drone has a digital license plate, and this is where that flyer is.
Gotcha.
But that's not to say that, anybody who's looking to do something nefarious purposes is going to follow remote ID. They're going to have that older drone. They aren't going to get the bolt on, and they're going to still fly it beyond visual line of sight and do what they want. But that real challenge then is for law enforcement to be able to find that individual just in the same way as we have today. I think the interest of, and I don't know if I want to say the FAA here, but the interest of Homeland Security, who is really pushing for remote ID, is to try to say, we see a drone in the sky, and with remote ID, we're going to have a better understanding of their intent. If they aren't broadcasting, if we see a drone in the sky that doesn't have remote ID, we have a good perception that maybe nefarious purposes are the intent. And now we can take some type of action, whether that's take the drone out of the sky, or put out all points alert for, find any drone operator in the vicinity.
So something that came out too with all this, and I don't know if it's that the PDF or the illustration of the drone, and it basically breaks down, what a suspicious drone is. I don't know if you saw that PDF.
Yeah, I did.
It's been passing around. I sort of feel like that's a little bit misleading. It's
terribly, right?
It's a bit of a stretch there, because I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, they just basically said that every FPV drone or every home built drone is suspicious at that point. But then they also seem to also inadvertently contradict themselves with that, because they also have amendments in remote ID for these. We'll call it home built drones, because that's how they list it. So we'll call it a home built drone, FPV drones, whatever you will. So I want to sort of transition here. So we understand from the hobbyist side, we understand about remote ID, where we're at for the hobbyist side. Let's talk about the guys who are buying, most of their products. I'll say 50% of what they buy needs to be put together, whether it be frame, ESC, motors, whatever. And a typical FPV drone, I buy whatever I need to build this drone, put it together. What happens to the guys who fly FPV, who build their drones in a homebrew situation? What happens to them?
Well, yeah. So one of the interesting things with the original proposal was that they had given this percentage to say, if you were, 51% of home built components, whatever, that puts you in this class. And the FAA backed away from that a little bit, and they said, oh, well, we aren't going to define it in that context. But the concept here is that FPV drone is, you're really taking it as not quite a manufacturer, where you're putting it together. You're kind of certifying that it's willing to or worthy to fly, versus a manufacturer certifying that it's worthy to fly. And that's where the FAA is really, I want to say, almost stringent, to the point of the expectation is that you are going to, one, either put on that bolt-on module and become RID compliant, or two, you are not going to have that remote ID module, and instead you're going to restrict yourself to an approved area. And with those approved areas, now you're talking about you need to be part of a CBO, a community-based organization. You're going to fly at an approved site. Usually that's an AMA
It's an AMA
field.
field. We'll just call it for what it is.
At this point, it's just AMA. I do think that what we've seen in this remote ID proposal is that you are going to have an opportunity to have other CBOs other than the AMA stood up. And at the same token, they are going to have that ability to request particular sites for their operations. One of the interesting aspects that the FAA had in there regarding FPV drones is drone racing. We know that drone racers like to go out and they have events where they're going to race each other. Who knows where that's going to be? And do we really want to have the extra weight of a remote ID module on there that's slowing things down? Is there really a cause for concern that these drones that are going to be on this particular course really need to be broadcasting? It's pretty ridiculous. So the FAA was open to the idea that you could have a field or area that was an event type of request,
exempt from
exempted
broadcast
for an event.
But that's not to say, so with these modules could be compliant to basically bolt to a drone. So obviously, let's say you wanted to fly an FPV drone like a GPS drone at that point, you would need this additional module mounted so you can broadcast your craft.
Yep.
And that would make you compliant at that point.
Yes, to an extent.
Now you pause there. So I know there's more, so elaborate.
There's the other challenge with FPV where you are putting on goggles.
Sure.
And the moment that you're putting on goggles is the moment that the FAA previously under 336 had said, you no longer qualify as a hobbyist. Having the goggles on, you must have a spotter, and that's going to require 107. Okay. Now, that's what they did under 336. They backed away from that with Section 349 in the 2018 FMRA, and started to give the idea that they would allow FPV goggles and operations with a hobbyist as having a spotter, at whatever field, right? The language in this remote ID actually more reflects the language of 336. And so you get it in your craw that they could go back to that idea that, no, you're under Part 107 operations in order to fly FPV with the goggles on. I think there's a decent chance that the FAA will clarify that in the coming days and return to the idea that hobbyists can still fly FPV and yet still use that remote ID module to do so.
Right. So I think I know a lot of hobbyists, and I know there's a lawsuit being presented from RDQ against the FAA over remote ID, feeling that it is unlawful. I'm not saying any lawsuit that challenges something like this is a bad idea, but personally, I know what it's like to fight City Hall. You often spend a lot of money and don't win. Yes, it's worth the challenge, but in an event like this, it feels like they're just sort of steamrolling ahead with what they're doing. Sadly. And that's not me being pessimistic. That's just me being a realist. Don't waste your money fighting something like this. We don't have enough lobbyists on our side to overturn anything like this, unfortunately, no matter how much money we threw at it. But it sounds like it's not a bad deal. And even if so, we still have roughly 3 years to make our FPV drones compliant. And at that point, technology has now propelled to where these modules could essentially be approved and built into whatever flight controllers even that we are going to be running at that point. I'm optimistic in that regard that nothing changes and technology will succeed in that manner of being able to broadcast. What I am concerned with is now what happens with all this data, with whether you are a hobbyist, whether you're flying FPV, whatever the case is, are these going to be used essentially against us? Obviously hate to bring it up, but we've seen the fines, we've seen the letters that have happened, and people are all like, "Oh my gosh, how did this happen?" Well, the means of them determining those fines was videos, visible proof. Are they now going to turn to the data and say, "Let me sift through this series of flights, these logs, and determine any sort of irregularities, sort of like speed cameras at a traffic light, and say, okay, these people violated, let's mail out letters or fines"? Is that something that you feel that they would do?
Unfortunately, I do.
Okay.
I see this, and I've said this back when we were talking about putting in the comments for the NPRM, that this is essentially a red light camera for drone operations.
These are nanny cams.
Yeah, nanny cams is a great concept, right? I look at it as the idea that they do have already the idea that you can track who's requested airspace authorization.
Right.
So if you don't have airspace authorization, cop rolls up, you're in trouble, right?
Absolutely.
At least once we get remote ID. Currently, a police officer can ask you for your, Part 107 certificate, and you don't have to show them. Under this new regulation, you will have to show them. And the same thing applies, that if you are flying right now and doing something wrong, flying over people, you found a concert in 2020. If you found a concert, you're doing all right. But next year you find a concert and you're going to fly over it, and you don't have remote ID, and now we're still talking in January, February.
Right.
The police officer could approach you and say, "Hey, you're in trouble." Okay. If you have to show your license at that point, you're going to be in trouble. They're going to track you back. The concept now is that if you're at the end of 2023, whatever, and we have remote ID in place, the officer doesn't have to roll up on you. Instead, they've got the information. You applied for this particular authorization for this airspace. That airspace was over the concert. Drone was spotted over the concert. We found the drone to be compliant with our ID, and our ID shows that you flew directly over that concert. You did not have the categorization for flight over people. Yeah, look out. Here comes a ticket. And that ticket is going to be more of an enforcement action. It's a civil action. It's not criminal,
Right?
But it's costly, right?
But are we gonna get to a point where fines are going to be so common at this point, where obviously with the more it's like speeding. Cops are peeling off tickets all the time. Are we going to see more proportional fines in that regard? Because right now I feel like when we see a singular fine, it's thousands. It's 1,000.
Right.
It's in the thousands. It's not really proportionate to the actual violation. And I don't give a shit what anybody says. I don't care, because I know there's a lot of like 107 elitists that are like, burn him to the stone, hit him for everything he's got. Those are the type of people that they can get bent. Like they don't belong here. But the fines need to be proportional, because what's going to happen is inadvertently, you may break a rule inadvertently, and that could be because you're trying to execute a safety procedure. You may be trying to give way to an aircraft, whatever the case may be. I feel like to just send out a fine without any explanation, you need to have a chance to appeal or at least defend yourself. The same as you do with a traffic ticket. You can go to court and you can roll the dice on the fact whether or not an officer is going to show up. I feel like you still need to have that ability to a certain extent. I'm not saying it's got to be like that, but I'm just sort of using that as an analogy.
Sure. And I do think that you'll see some of that. So if you had some inadvertent mistake and that was a concern, and the red lights camera, so to speak, caught you, that nanny cam caught you, I think there's still an opportunity that the FSDO, the safety officer, is going to reach out to you and say, okay, hey, we saw this. This is not within legal operation? Do you know what's happening? And you can have that explanation. I think what happens though is if there's a pattern of,
right, they're gonna look for a series
yeah,
of repeatable behavior.
exactly. But at the same token, and I think you hit on it, right, is that our next step in this community is going to the FAA and saying, look, you can charge $1,500 as a fine for somebody that flew a Cessna improperly, blah, blah, blah. But is there really that same level of risk with a Mavic? And does that fine equate to the same, concerns? So it's almost like speeding on a bicycle. Are you going to get a ticket for $165 for going 5 miles over a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit? You're on a bike.
Well, I mean, I have seen somebody get pulled over here in Florida. If this shocks you, somebody got a DUI on their lawnmower. So again, that's Florida.
Welcome to Florida, right?
I digress. So another thing that people were curious too about was the 249 gram rule. Obviously, 249 grams didn't need a registration. That is still upheld here in the Remote Identification Act. We're not going to see sub 249 gram drones have the need for broadcast ID.
Correct.
Which is sort of cool to see that. But there's the but.
Here's the but. One of the things that came alongside the remote ID is flight over people and flight at night, right?
Correct.
And in flight over people, there was that same 249 grams that is going to allow you to fly over people. And that's going to go into effect basically when it publishes. It's in 60 days. But when you look very closely at that 249 grams, one of the things that the FAA added was to say, you cannot fly over people at 249 grams unless your props are covered. They aren't going to lacerate human skin. Now, think of your 249 gram drones, the Mavic Mini, Mavic Mini 2, right? Those are 249 gram drones. But put your prop guards on. You are no longer under that 0.55 pound limit, right? And so you are not going to qualify as a Category 1 drone to fly over people. So either we have to find a new prop guard solution that's heavier, or people are going to start taking sandpaper to that Mavic Mini case, and try to see if they can get the weight down in order to get under that weight for the class to be able to fly over people.
So we're probably talking about something about this size with a camera, loaded, battery. You're about 239 grams loaded. That's takeoff weight. You throw in a module. We'll say that the module is going to weigh, 16 grams or so. You're still under that 249 grams. It sounds like what they're really referencing is going to be something more along the lines of your Cinewoop, where, this is not technically on the surface going to lacerate or cause any physical harm to somebody if you flew over it. I think a lot of people saw, oh my gosh, I can fly over people now. And they didn't really read into the rules that it's 249 grams takeoff with prop guard protection, which, you're right. The Mini, none of the Minis comply. There isn't any consumer purchase drone today that comply. Now, these homebrews, obviously, these bind and fly Cinewhoops, these are capable of that. But again, if you're going to take this over a person, now you have to be broadcasting so they know exactly where you are and why you're doing whatever it is that you're doing. So that's something to consider for anybody who's thinking about that. Moving more towards the 107 side of life, I know people are excited because they have removed the need to have a daylight waiver, which has always been proving to be sort of a pain in the neck, an Achilles heel for any sort of drone professional that does thermal scans, whatever it may be. You had to have that daylight waiver to be compliant to fly at the hours needed to do those scans. And there's other obvious reasons why you would want that. And one of the biggest issues was, we've seen hobbyists for months able to fly at night. Obviously, they couldn't exceed the 400-foot cap, but they've been able to fly at night. Yet while the 107 technically on paper, the more responsible type weren't able to. So it was always a sort of an odd thing. Explain that to us. How is this going to play out to where you're now going to not need a daylight waiver to fly at night?
Yeah. So in Part 107, they have been itching for a very long time to be able to fly at night. And many have chased the waivers to do so. The daylight waiver was the most requested and the most
Absolutely.
approved waiver by the FAA. And I think the FAA finally saw, hey, we were overzealous in terms of locking down night flight. We haven't seen the concerns of crashes with airplanes. We haven't seen them fall out of the sky and hurt people or property. And so they've recognized we really can back away from this at this point. Now they've kept in the idea that if you are planning to fly at night, you need to have a strobe light that's going to be able to be seen for 3 miles. So that doesn't change in terms of what they had required for even those people who were grabbing up the night waivers.
Right.
But that concept is there that, hobbyists have been able to fly forever at night, no waivers necessary. And this is now starting to catch up and be able to have Part 107 do the same. Now, in doing that, they had to be able to say, oh, well, we are going to allow that within certain conditions. And that condition is going to be the idea that you need to train. The concept is that you can have night illusions that can make it more difficult to fly the drone. And that's something that they don't want to have happen. So you are now going to have a training that includes a night training to remain current with your Part 107. The good news is you aren't going to have to take that Part 107 recurrent exam. So no longer are you going to go back to the testing office and pay a fee to take an exam that you already had taken before and already knew the answers of. Instead, you're going to just do a training, get compliant so that you can then go ahead and fly at night.
So with the 107, so obviously we're talking about not having to go back, do the recurrent test. I know a lot of people are confused on that as well in the 107 realm. So let's say anybody who's taking we'll call it the COVID recurrent, because there's a lot of us who did that. We had our recurrence due and we opted to take that online test. This goes live in 60 days. Are we going to have to go back and do a recurrent test? Or do we fall under the new bracket? Because there's a lot of misconceptions on this. I've seen this in the commercial group, people asking these questions, and I don't necessarily know they're getting the right answer. So where does it sit right now? If your test fell in September, you got that 6-month extension. What happens when this rule is finally published? Do you take it online or do you have to do anything at all?
Well, yeah. So the interesting thing is, first and foremost, people have to understand when their currency is up, right? So when you've taken your test, let's say I took the test on the 2nd of the month. Well, your expiration is not on the 2nd of the month. 2 years from now, it's on the last day of that month. So if I took it on the 2nd of December, a couple of years back, then I'm going to expire on the 31st of December of this year, right? So that's the first part. Understand when your currency goes and expires, and know that you have through the end of the month. Beyond that, so let's say somebody's coming up next month, right? That they're coming up for their expiration, and they're thinking, "Gosh, I really want to get in on this flight over people and night flight, and I want to be able to do that, but I have to go get my recurrent." Well, unfortunately, you're stuck. You are going to, because this rule does not go live in time, you're going to have to take the test and become recurrent in January if you're expiring in January. And then once you've got that currency, you're still going to have to take the training in order to be able to fly at night.
Now,
because
what's
the
that
rule
training
hasn't gone
going
into
to
effect.
persist of? Did they outline how you go about this training?
Sort of.
Okay.
um, yeah. The training itself is going to. I don't know that they spent a whole lot of time detailing what all is involved in that,
Okay.
but we do have ASTM standards that have been developed for drone flights at night, and I think that that's what you're going to see. Now, I need to go a great deal more in depth with that. I haven't done that, but we will get there.
Okay. So still to be determined. So, but this goes live though 60 days from so basically this is going live in February then.
Well, no. So it'll be 60 days from when this publishes. We're expecting this to publish someplace towards the end of January.
So the end of January. So best rule of thumb, anybody who's taking that extension, let's say we'll use September as the date, you're going to have to get recurrent because September, you're set to actually expire end of February then at that point. That would be the 6-month mark if I'm not mistaken.
No, that would be March.
March. So March.
You'd be probably pretty good. Yeah, I would expect this will be done before the end of March.
I think we'd be close. It's always best to just know the rules and to stay sort of relevant in everything.
Right.
But I mean, from my understanding, so once this does go live, we're no longer going to have to enter these testing facilities, which is great. However, that's with the exception of people who are going to be taking the test for the first time. Is that correct?
Yeah. If you haven't yet taken the Part 107 and you want to become Part 107 certified, you are stuck. You are going to have to go and take the test at the location. And the FAA laid out the reasoning for that is that they want to make sure you are you.
Right.
And exactly. So that was part of it, because another piece of Part 107 is your TSA security check, right? So not only are you showing that you know airspace, you can understand the concepts of airspace, but you have to pass that TSA security test, background check. And if they can't pinpoint that you are you, then what's the point of that background check?
Right. And then it just becomes a whatever type of test. So, and I get that, and I can appreciate that. I can also appreciate the fact that they're treating this more like a license, because I renew my license, when it's due, but I don't have to sit there and take another driving test. With that being said, I mean, some people probably should, but not my call. But I like where they're going with this, because I know for me specifically, there's been times where I'm like, I have to take this recurrent. So when COVID happened, I jumped at that opportunity because I didn't have time to go into a facility. There was no way. There was just no way I had time to deal with that. So that was convenient for me. And I'm sure a lot of other operators are probably thinking the same, like, man, that's really convenient. Now, with everything said and done, because I think we've pretty much, simplified everything. The short and long of it all is it's a better situation than we were facing last year this day. It's a brighter hope. Manufacturers are still going to put out quads. They're still going to put out drones. Nothing's going to really stop in that regard. They're still going to do it, because now we have the ability to have a unit that's going to bolt on in some form of capacity. We don't know what size or weight those are going to be at this point, because again, they don't exist. We have 3 years before we'll probably ever see the physical inception of one of these. And then there's the probability or the possibility that could there be amendments to this rule, as they say, well, wait a second, it's not going to work out the way it is. Does that happen in these instances where they sort of reverse course on certain things that they put out there? Or when they slam that hammer, that is what it is?
Don't anticipate seeing that. Whenever we're talking about regulations, it takes forever. When we look at, when Part 107 was first proposed, it was the end of 2014, and we didn't see the actual finalization until August of 2016. Here with remote ID, we're talking, similar timeframes. So if there's going to be a change, permanently to the regulation, that goes through the NPRM process with public comment and what have you. That's going to take forever. Now, can they do some further tweaks in terms of helping define situations or helping to clarify situations. Absolutely. And I think you're going to see the FAA has already said they are going to produce another advisory circular that gives more direction. And that'll be a very short summarization of certain things within remote ID or certain things within
which I think is important, because as we look at these pages, 470 pages, and as I started reading through this, I was thinking to myself, like, wow, a lot of this is redundant. They say a lot of things twice in a different way, and people can misinterpret this. So I can see how there are, even with the rules that we have today, sometimes the rules are sort of mushy. They don't make a lot of sense to most that read this. Like the average drone pilot just wants to know what they can and can't do. They don't care about all the other bullshit. So I guess if I just had to recap everything we talked about, remote ID, it comes in 3 different flavors, essentially. Just want you to hear this out. We have the standard remote ID, which allows someone to see you, the pilot location, your ground station location, as well as the drone. So that will also essentially, and I say essentially because it hasn't been invoked yet, allow beyond visual line of sight flights. The second comes in form of the remote ID broadcast module, which in turn would render the same results we have right now. Right now, we're allowed 400 feet and we have to fly within visual line of sight. So this module just showcases where the drone is at. So nothing changes with the exception of you now have a module adhered to your drone and you're required to have that, let's say, license plate. Same as if you were driving on the road. And then the third thing is the FAA, they call them the FRIA areas, which is a terrible name if you ask me, which is a FAA recognized identification area. So that could be anywhere they define that is acceptable for a UAV. So for like the RC pilots that currently are limited to, fields essentially, well, they're not really limited, but they have AMA approved fields. It sounds like the FAA says
don't want to change the configuration of their machine to have the new broadcast module.
Right. Yeah. So you're gonna be limited to those fields. So, I mean, it's obviously not the best. The best would be this didn't happen at all, but that's not the world we live in. So there is some hope, and the fact is, we have to now at this point we have the final ruling here, and a lot of people are going to hit the panic button like the hobby is dead. Not dead. People are going to be like, the goddamn government, the conspiracy theorists. Those are the people that need to take a Xanax. Like, just hit a Xanax. I don't care. Smoke a pipe, whatever. I don't care what you got to do. Relax. We have 3 years for technology now to exceed this rule. I have faith that manufacturers are going to be able to be compliant with this, along with hobby grade compliancy as well, because if we can build things that fly, a module that does these requirements shouldn't be that difficult to achieve with a low weight and I would say moderate hindrance to our existing quads. But chances are by the time we get to this point, new drones are already going to have what's needed to be able to do this. Now, one thing I want to touch on is I saw a blip in here talking about ADS-B. Is that now prohibited?
So that is, I think, the beauty of this is that we constantly saw people say, well, the solution is just attach ADS-B to any drone, and that will be the end all be all. And we constantly said, no, you can't do that. Number one, our drones are too small, where they're too frequent, too many to keep up with. All you would be is ground clutter. You would just be this clutter in the sky that any ATC is going to say, oh, wait, we got lots of planes there. Something's going to crash.
Right.
And the FAA had specifically pointed out ADS-B will not be allowed on drones. And I think that's a really good thing. It changes the course of action, where if you had ADS-B on your drone and you have a Cessna coming over that has ADS-B, then you're going to see that and go, well, wait a minute, I'm good. And the Cessna is going to see that and go, wait a minute, I'm bad. and there's going to be a
Right.
correction on their part.
Causes the aerial conflict at that point.
Right. To them, they're seeing it as I'm going to have a crash and I'm going
Right.
to take evasive action. And at that point, now that pilot is going to say, hey, that drone was in my way.
Right.
Right. And that's a
Exactly.
reflection on us that we don't want. So I think that's a good thing to get rid of ADSB.
I agree 100%. And I'm good with that. So I think we covered pretty much everything. The biggest takeaway from this video, if you made it this far, what I didn't want was a bunch of misinformation. What I didn't want was just reading these rules without exemplary explanation after the fact, because I think a lot of times it's really easy for a creator, for us to come on here and just read the rules. But just reading the rules doesn't make you an expert on this matter. I'm not an expert on this matter. Ryan is. This is what he does for a living. He analyzes these rules. He understands the logic behind what the FAA is presenting us, and he could provide rebuttals to my questions that I don't think I could have gotten just by reading these rules. The interpretation of these rules are important, but it's more important to have that understanding that, like I said, that's why I wanted you on here, Ryan, because I think you, above anybody that I know, is super analytical when it comes to this, and you've been around this numerous times. So thank you very much for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for breaking it down in a way that everybody can easily digest and hopefully put some fears to rest, obviously, but now it's when the work is going to actually take place.
Absolutely. And Ken, let me finish up with one thing. And this is where I still have a great concern about remote ID, and I think every drone operator should as well. And that is the concept that the information that is going to be shared with remote ID pinpoints your exact location.
That is scary.
And so you are going to be noticed, right, in the sky. Here's my drone in the sky. That public member who doesn't like drones, who has a gun, is going to be able to say, I'm going to figure out where that's coming from, who's flying it, and they are going to be able to use their cell phone, dial up that information, figure out exactly where you are, and pay you a visit. That's a major concern, and so
that is an
pilots,
issue.
we need to be. Yeah,
that needs to be anonymized a little bit. I don't think general public needs to have that information. I've said that before when we first started talking about probability of this, when DJI presented their solution, that there needs to be some limits to that. There needs to be a freaking limit to that, because we talk about the gun. Another thing, and this doesn't affect everybody, but people that know drones, and if they know this, they would look and they would say, okay, well, who's flying that? When I'm flying, I'm going to be completely real. I don't like to be bothered.
Right.
The other thing is, I wouldn't want to be robbed when I'm flying, especially, we talk about, you need to have a spotter with FPV, but if we're flying FPV, I'm under the goggles, my spotter's watching what I'm doing, keeping me safe. Somebody says, oh, they're flying there. They're going to come up on us and potentially rob us because they knew who we are, or whatever the case is. It just, it opens a can of worms. And I've always felt that most of the people in this hobby, and I say most of us, are really, really super responsible. We're trying to do everything we can and do our due diligence to protect the little bit of, pleasure we have with this hobby that isn't commercialized, the ones that do fly for fun or do have a good time with it. We do what we can to protect it to our best of our ability. Obviously, nobody's perfect. We're going to screw up from time to time, but that does worry me that they did not take that into an account. And I hope that is one of the things that does get revised, or they do give more consideration to.
Unfortunately, I don't think they're going to. And that's where my advice is that going forward, once remote ID does get into place, I would definitely encourage everyone who's flying to have some type of security plan, that you may need a second spotter that's spotting people coming towards you. That's going to be something that I think is inevitable. You are going to have the Karens, if you will, that want to come in and complain and bother you. which could put you into an emergency situation. And you're going to have the more hostile individuals who might be there to physically harm you, physically damage your stuff. And so it's going to be very important that you have some type of security plan in place to take care of those situations.
I think what I'm probably going to end up doing is when this all plays out and the rule is finally finalized, I'm probably going to get tattooed on my knuckles, "Fuck you." So when I'm flying, I'm going to fly. I'm a pincher. So that's what people see as I'm flying. So they don't mess. They just see my knuckles, and they don't have to. They don't even try to talk. They just know, okay, this is a fuck off situation. We'll go the other way. I'm kidding. Ryan, thank you so much, man, for coming on.
Thank you.
Hopefully you guys made it this far into the video. I know it was an hour long, but there's a lot of good information, a lot of good nuggets of explanation, and hopefully it can calm your nerves a little bit, because this has been obviously an incredibly hot topic for many months. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on, man. Alrighty. Well, that's going to do it for this conversation on remote ID. There's still so much more to learn and understand and process. And there's going to be several videos, obviously, on this in which you can digest, watch, get different takes, opinions, whatever it is that you want out of this. But just know, just business as usual for the next 3 years. And if you're not already up in the air flying, there's no better time to start than now to fly. Just understand what you're getting into. And you obviously will not be disappointed when the finalization occurs and these little modules are hanging off your drone like ball sacks. Alrighty, that's going to do it. As always, stay original.